I did retire in June from everything. Well, I'm an adjunct, obviously. I'll be back teaching my defense budget class in the fall. There's a veteran of that class sitting right here, and so you can ask her what it's like. But what I really didn't retire from was Gettysburg. I took students up there last fall. We didn't do this presentation last fall. We used the video, and it struck me then that I was answering questions up at the battlefield that I had tried to answer in the presentation. So Jordan and I conspired to actually do a live presentation with time for Q&A. But I'm not a military historian. I'm a political scientist. But the more I got into the Civil War, both going to Gettysburg and teaching 501, the more fascinated I am with it, not as military history, but as sort of the social political history of the United States. Slavery is an issue that is there right up through today, and the Civil War is the crux of it. And I guess my takeaway is, I think even though I love going to Gettysburg and it's a fascinating battle, I never get tired of going up there. I think we spend too much time studying the battles of the Civil War and not enough time studying Reconstruction and what happened to America. Because this is, in terms of 501 and military strategy, remember not to resurrect Clausewitz when you're reading lunch, but, with Clausewitz, strategy, you have to have a vision of where you want to be when you're done. It's not just defeating the enemy. We spend so much time with that. It's what kind of a world do I want? I'm going to probably move around a bit. With the Civil War, you see the North wins the war and to a great extent loses the peace. And I'll go into that here. This isn't just about background to Gettysburg. This is the whole enchilada, although I don't spend a whole lot of time with it. I think if you were teaching about how wars end, Civil War would be one you'd spend a couple or three lessons on, and then we'd go to World War II and other wars. Anyway, how many of you are going up on Saturday? Oh. And any international students? Okay. This originated 8 years ago, I guess, when Bruce Hoffman was director, and some of the international students saw the 501 syllabus, saw 2 lessons on the Civil War, the American Civil War. When you say Civil War to an international student, oh, which one? But for us, it's the American Civil War. And said, we don't know anything about the American Civil War. Can you have somebody do a summary? And I volunteered to do that. I hate to tell them, but most Americans don't know much about the Civil War either. So this is useful. And I didn't know much about the Civil War. This presentation and going to Gettysburg and sharing the duties with Jim Raybon and John Gordon, who are just really good on this, never cease to learn. Okay? So that's the beginnings of this. This is sort of what I want to do. It's a long outline. I'll move through it pretty quickly, though. But the role of slavery in the run-up to the war and sort of the strategy on both sides. Well, I don't need to read this for you. I will spend some time with the battlefield because when you're up there, it's like you're not looking at a map. You're in the midst of it all. You can lose track of where you are. So I'll try to show how this battle progresses and where we'll be on Saturday. We'll have a lot of fun. I don't know, anybody got a weather report for Saturday? What's it looking like? We do this rain, snow, sleet, or hail, but it's really nice if it's a day like today. In fact, today is perfect because there's no sunlight. It's just a little overcast. That's great. Okay, got to start with Clausewitz, right? You just have to. And this is the most quoted Clausewitzian phrase ever, and like a lot of quoted books, it's quoted and not truly understood, and I'm not sure I fully understand it, but each time I read book 1, each time I talk 501, but we Americans, I think in particular, tend to see there's peace and there's war. And what politics is saying, no, what Clausewitz is saying is there's politics, and sometimes politics can't solve a problem and it goes violent, and we call that war. And then somebody wins that war and comes back to politics, but it's sort of a continuum rather than a stark differentiation. And I think that mentality is one reason, not the most important reason, why the North doesn't pay much attention to Reconstruction. Hey, we won the war, okay? It's over. I have a quote in here where, in some ways, it's just starting, and the North doesn't get it. Okay? But the most important thing is to see war as part of a continuum where politics, violence, politics, again, my favorite Clausewitz phrase is, in war the result is never final, which really links to this point about war and then there's peace. But I mean, the enemy doesn't roll over and play dead in peace unless you take the Genghis Khan approach to war, in which case they're all dead, which really does solve a political problem, Not available to the modern general, but pretty impressive back in, I'm not advocating that, don't misquote me. Politics continues. And the defeated state or whatever, I mean, look at ISIS. ISIS has been defeated, right? Well, they're regrouping in a different way. Well, the South did that. That happens all the time. And finally, this I find an enigmatic phrase by Clausewitz. From the start, you have to think of every war as a whole. So you see the end when you launch. How does Clausewitz square this with? I mean, his book one is full of statements about how uncertain war is. Fog, friction, the enemy gets a vote. You start a war and you lose control of it because you're handing some of the logic to the enemy. And the only answer I have is, if you don't have a vision of where you want to end up, when you launch into that uncertainty, you don't know where you're going to go. Right? I'm going to say something else here too. I did go. My experience, I got to breathe Agent Orange in Vietnam and oil smoke in the Gulf. That's my primary memory of the two wars I've been in. And they're still lurking around in my body, I assume. But in the Gulf War, I was just a little lieutenant colonel in a war full of generals and colonels. In Riyadh, out at Escon Village, and I remember 3 days after Christmas, 1990, the Corps commanders come over to what was called the schoolhouse, which is where we had our briefings. And this is General Luck and Freddie Franks, General Franks, and they brief on their Corps plans, which involved taking southern Iraq all the way up to the Euphrates. And the G3, the ops guy of the Third Army, turns around to us at the peanut gallery and says, "Any questions?" And I said, "Okay, you've taken southern Iraq. Now, how are you going to get out?" And his answer was, "That's the next plan." Wrong. I mean, that's exactly how the Army planned back then. Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3, Phase 4. How about Phase 7, and then let's work our way back, right? And I think the Army actually gets this. I think the Joint Staff gets it. But boy, I mean, for him to say that, and we had no idea what to do with that position, and so we kind of gave it away. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, slavery and strategy. We do think of North and South as slavery, North is anti-slavery. If you're from the North, the South are the bad guys. It's very, very kind of dichotomous, and that's not at all the reality. Okay, in the South, one of the mysteries to me is most Southerners don't own slaves. There's yeoman farmers up in the mountains, and they really hate the planters, right? Because the planters control the politics, and they're pretty ruthless about it. So one question I've always asked is, how did the planters get all these guys to fight so valiantly? And there's no question that Lee's army is a brave army. Without shoes, sometimes very ill-fed. They fought and died for the South, and I still don't understand that. If somebody has an answer to that, you can give it to me. The South is a variegated whole. There's a set of people who own 2 or 3 slaves, but I always refer to Gone with the Wind. Tara, tens or even hundreds of slaves, those are few and far between. Okay, and they're the guys who control politics before the war and rise and control politics after the war. Now, the breakdown in the North is more complicated, and it helps us understand why Reconstruction failed. You know, you do have some diehard abolitionists. Randolph Stevens in the movie Lincoln. You all learn your history from movies now, so let me. There are books in this subject. I wouldn't want to trouble you with that. You know, Charles Sumner in the Senate. You know, these are both from Massachusetts. Probably Massachusetts is a hotbed of abolitionists, and there's a religious revival in the North, mostly in Massachusetts, Connecticut, upstate New York, where this becomes a very religious issue. But there's Northern Democrats. The Democratic Party splits apart. We know Southern Democrats were the planners. They were Democrats until 1972, and then they became Republicans. They don't care about slavery. They care about union. A lot of the Union generals are Democrats. George McClellan. Some of the, you know, I mean, we worry about being embarrassed by our emails. This guy should have destroyed all of his letters to his wife. I mean, they just ooze sanctimoniousness and arrogance. I mean, the guy saw himself as some kind of God-appointed general. He could care less about the slavery problem. He wants, and so he's not interested in defeating Lee. He just wants to beat Lee up enough that we have a negotiation here. We get Union back together again. Then there's these financiers, you know, in Boston and New York. You know, if you go back to 1850, the North is industrializing. The railroad has come along. There's the emergence of a market economy. If you read McPherson's book, Battle Cry of Freedom, how many of you read that? There's no movie on this. It's a Pulitzer Prize winner. There's a reason for that. It's the best book on the subject. But it's really a social history of the United States up to 1860. And what's happening is the North is undergoing the Industrial Revolution, right? But most of that's directed toward people going west. The North doesn't export a whole lot. It sells a lot of industrial goods, but mostly to its own population, which is what we do now, by the way. We've never been a trading state. We don't trade that much as a part of our GDP. The South does nothing but trade, right? Cotton. High quality, amazing how cheap it is, too, when you have slave labor, right? So they're selling, I mean, Britain and France are getting 80 or 90% of their cotton, and they love the quality of it. So that's where all the nation's hard currency goes. Well, the bankers all through the North see a prize when they see it, right? So they're deeply involved in lending to the plantation owners and reaping the profits. The mayor of New York actually says, I'm pretty sure this is true, in 1861, after most of the southern states have seceded, maybe we should secede too. I mean, we make an awful lot of our money off what's going on in the South, right? So the notion that you can confine slavery, that's the Southerners, you know. Slavery is insidious. It works its way into society in a number of ways. Nobody has a vision. What do we want slaves to be when we free them? We fight this war, we free the slaves. Nobody has that vision, including Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln is a colonizer for a lot of his adult life. He's opposed to slavery. Colonizers, it became very popular in the 1850s. Free the slaves, send everybody back to Africa. Right? In other words, we want to be a free white country. And Lincoln is that way too. There's a funny, true story. I mean, this is typical of Lincoln, who never stops learning. I mean, he can be egregiously wrong, but he keeps peeling back the onion, and he gets it right in the end. So you have to admire him. But he asked his staff, you know, he's president, the African Americans in Washington, D.C. have been freed once the war starts. He says, go down to the local Episcopal church, the black Episcopal church. Bring in the vestry or whatever you call it. And I want to talk to them. And he says, you know, we're going to free you, and then there's this wonderful place down off the coast of Panama, or you can go back to Africa. And they look at him like, Mr. President, are you out of your mind? You know, we're just like you. We were born here. Our parents didn't choose to come here like yours did, but we're born. All we want to do is enjoy the fruits of America's success. We just want to be like everybody else. And okay. Lincoln gets that. And by the end of the war, he has decided that the only way to deal with this freed slaves are American citizens just like everybody else. By the way, this is men. Okay, the women's movement tries to hook itself up to the abolitionist movement. Abolitionists want nothing to do. You know, you guys have your own fight. Go off and do that, and it takes them many more decades to sort of get the vote in, and so forth. So, and he gives this speech on the lawn of the White House, late March, just as the war's ending. John Wilkes Booth is in the audience, and is heard to say, "That's the last speech that son of a bitch ever gives," and he kills him next week. I mean, he dies less than a week after the end of the war. After that, but maybe the more important thing is, I think the North is almost as racist as the South. I mean, everybody in the 19th century, except Sumner and Stevens and I mean, they're embarrassed by slavery. It's a moral stain. But okay, so freed slaves are going to come move into your neighborhood. Oh no, don't want that. You know, marry my daughter? No, I don't think so. You know, it's just so. Well, so it's no wonder that Lincoln's vision, which he finally arrives at after 3 or 4 years of really wrestling with, isn't widely shared, and it falls apart in Reconstruction. Okay. So anyway, this is not nearly the kind of, I hate to use black and white. This is, you know, good guys, bad guys. This is not bifurcated. It's extremely complicated, and I'm not even scratching the surface. There's just a huge literature on this. Okay. Lincoln, I think Lincoln is actually morally opposed to slavery from early in his life. He really believes that all men are created equal. But he also is a lawyer. He's a constitutionalist, and he realizes that the original slave states signed the Constitution, right? Their whole position is embedded in that document. So if you're going to take slavery away from them, you're endangering the Constitution. So his position going into the war, and it's a Republican platform in 1860, is we're not going to do anything about slavery in the original 6 slave states. We're just not going to add any slave states as new states come into the Union. And of course, that's been the source of the problem over the last 20 years, Kansas and Arkansas and so forth. Of course, the South sees through that because they have to, you know, there's a reason we have a Senate. Actually, there's several reasons. One of them is, though, it protects small states. And the southern states are small when it comes to population. I'll show you a chart on that in a minute. But it's Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, they're small states too. The South realizes that if we're the only slave state, sooner or later we're going to be outvoted in the Senate. So nothing doing here. So the other reason Lincoln soft pedals the slavery issue, and this becomes the basis for the South's history that slavery wasn't really the issue here, it was all about states' rights, which is baloney, absolute baloney. Read any secession statement by any government in the South, published days after they seceded. The second sentence is, our very special institution, slavery, right? This is about slavery, but Lincoln soft pedals it because he's terribly worried that he'll lose Maryland and Kentucky, especially Kentucky. He's heard by his staff to say, if we lose Kentucky, we just kiss this goodbye. They'll have the Ohio River as a northern boundary. They'll have all the resources of Kentucky. So he doesn't want to, Kentucky and Tennessee are both half slave, half free. I mean, you get up into the mountains, slaves just aren't cost effective. It's the plantations, it's the flat rice, sugar, tobacco. Where they're useful. So he downplays slavery to keep the border states in. And he actually does keep Kentucky in the Union. Okay? He keeps that soft policy. You know, the generals in the North, slaves will flock to the military perimeter, right? Because on the other side of it is freedom. And some of the generals said, yeah, they're free now. And Lincoln said, oh, no, they're not. You know, that, again, I'm trying to keep Kentucky in the Union. It isn't really until 1863 that he hardens up on that. In fact, you know, the interesting character here is Grant. If you have 6 months to read a 1,000-page book, it's Cherno's biography of Grant, which is 1,000 pages long. The first half is the war, the second half is presidency. And you know, Grant's out west. Nobody even sees him out there. In fact, he's a failure when the war starts. And he's left the Army and he comes back in as a state militia colonel, and then, I mean, he just wins. He just, you know, he fights. But you know, so slaves would come across, and pretty soon, you know, the attitude was, well, okay, they're, I mean, not going to be good soldiers, but they can dig trenches, they can cook for us, they can do logistics. Well, Grant starts out that way. And then he starts to form black units. Now, you want a motivated unit? There is just no, so they turn out to be great soldiers, right? So by the end of the war, Grant is an abolitionist. He just thinks this is nuts, right? And he learns that from his experience. He's really an interesting fellow. You ought to read that book. Now, the Union generals, you have the McClellanites. That's, I said earlier, McClellan doesn't care about slavery. Abolitionists are minority. At Gettysburg, you have abolitionist generals and Northern Democrats, and they don't like one another, and they stab one another in the back. We won't get into that too much on Saturday. There's a, you know, after Gettysburg, when Meade really refuses to chase Lee and surround him and force his army to surrender, Lincoln's son Robert finds him in the Oval Office, you know, just sort of tears in his eyes. He feels himself the victim of a McClellanite conspiracy, right? These generals just, he's been telling them, you've got to destroy Lee's army, and they won't do it for him. And then the next year he finds Grant, and that changes. Okay, so you have really most of the generals in the Eastern Theater are McClellanites. Okay. In the North, I always say Lincoln has a strategy. You just can't find a general that will effect it, who will implement it. You know, isolate the South. The North gets the Navy, and it gets most of the shipyards. So I mean, you do have the Merrimack and the Monitor. You do have the emergence of a Southern Navy, but the Navy is sort of the North's Navy at the beginning of the war. So they shut down the South Coast, except Wilmington, North Carolina, where the Cape Fear River kind of comes in an angle, and the Rhett Butlers of the world can connive their way out into the open seas. And then Mobile, Alabama. Take a look on a map at Mobile. It's way up inland, and it's very easily defensible. They don't fall until 1864. Stop talking to me about Richmond. All the Union generals want to take Richmond. And he says, I don't care about Richmond. I care about Lee's army, and I want to destroy that. Now, destroy is a little strong. That's my word. You know, I want it to surrender. And he can't find a general. The generals in the East, for reasons I've already described, are pretty reluctant to go with him. He goes through them, asking, would you take over the army? And none of them really wants to do it. In the end, he orders Meade on 2 days before Gettysburg, when they fire Hooker. So that's the first time he actually just orders somebody. And Meade is a McClellanite. Okay. Which is probably one reason he doesn't pursue Lee. The other is they're so afraid of him that they're just, it's a trap. He looks sweet, but if we go after him, he'll pull a surround us, you know, trap. And McClellan was the worst of those. Okay, Grant's out west, and he just fights, and he loses one day, and then he wins the next. I mean, he gives and takes. He learns a different approach to war, which is why when we used to read what's his name's book about the Overland Campaign, which is the last invasion from the north into the south, and Grant is sharing leadership. He's the commanding general of the army, but Meade's still the army commander, and they have totally different styles, and they ultimately just don't much like one another, because Grant's idea is we just plow into them and find out what happened. Okay, well, it looks a little weak over here, let's go over here. No, let's go over here. You know, and Meade just wants to set up a defensive perimeter, like Gettysburg, and let him come to me, you know. He's an engineer. They're funny like that. Okay. So Grant, anyway. Okay, in the South, Davis has the general. Lee is not popular at first. He loses West Virginia. Virginia on the map in 1861 is a big state, and then West Virginia breaks off. Davis sends Lee off to bring it back in, and of all things, he meets McClellan, and McClellan wins that one. Lee then becomes the military advisor to Davis, and he orders trenches all around Richmond, and he's called the Lee of Spades, or the General of Spades or Robert E. Spades, something like that. But what he's trying to do, of course, is defend Richmond with as few troops as he can, because he's outnumbered. Okay, so McClellan, after being prodded by Lincoln, takes ships down to the end of the James River, the peninsula, and starts working his way up. This is the Peninsular Campaign in May and June of 1862, really the first major campaign of the war. And as they actually get up to where they can hear the bells of Richmond, they can see the spires. And of course, the press in the North, war's going to end by Christmas. Don't ever believe that phrase, right? Because World War I, over by Christmas, right? When anybody tells you that, just find somebody else to talk. Okay. So then the commander of Confederate forces is Joe Johnson. He's the senior general in the Army. He's also kind of a bullet magnet. That's the word we use in Vietnam. You know, he just gets shot a lot. He lives through the war. But he's hit in the foot or the leg, and he goes to the hospital, and Davis says, "Okay, Lee, take it over." Well, Lee proceeds to just run circles around McClellan, just driving down the peninsula, and from then on, Lee is iconic in the South. He's more popular than Davis, who isn't a particularly likable guy, stiff, brittle, kind of moralistic, and Lee is much, I think, more popular. They can't agree on a strategy, and it's a simple reason: these states all seceded because they wanted to be independent states, right? This is states' rights. So now this guy up in Richmond is taxing me, is asking for a draft, is asking for troops. No, I'm here to defend Georgia. So Davis can never get the governors to give him what he wants. Meanwhile, Lee is saying, we can't defend the whole perimeter of the South. The North can attack anywhere. Lee's strategy is and this is controversial. I happen to think this is the only workable strategy for a country, the Confederacy, that's outnumbered, out-industrialized, out almost everything. Lee says, I'm going to take this war north, and all I want to do, I can't occupy the North. I just want to defeat the Army of the Potomac. So embarrassingly that it changes the politics, and Lee is replaced by a Democrat. Or in the midterms, the Congress goes Democrat. Okay, that's Antietam. Gettysburg is sort of aimed at Lincoln himself. Okay, so that's Lee's strategy, and when he goes to Gettysburg, we'll talk much more about this on Saturday on the bus trip going up. But he's asking, he makes clear to Davis and the cabinet, this is it. I don't think I can invade the North too many more times. We just don't have that many forces. So I need 150,000 troops. Davis gives about half that. And it's I'm not sure Davis buys into this strategy, but the state governors are deeply mixed on it. So Lee is really going for broke, and he doesn't have the force that he needs to do it. And when you think back, geez, if he had 150,000 troops, this would be a little different country today, I think. Because he would have. It wouldn't have been Pickett's charge. It would have been 4 divisions and they would have made it to the other side. Okay. So Davis has the general. It takes him a long time and he never comes to agree on a strategy. Lee has such prestige that he gets what he wants, but he doesn't get the numbers. Okay. Now, can you all see that? Have you seen this in 501? All it says is, to me it says, if you're the Confederacy, why in the world would you attack the North, right? Because all the numbers up here are bigger, including, I love this, acres of farmland, And that's food farmland, right? The South has all sorts of land under cultivation. It's cotton, you can't eat it. And they're so anxious to keep the possibility open that they can export to England and bring the English into the war, that they don't switch to food until very late in the war, and they're starving. The people of Richmond, Virginia are starving in 1864. Okay, but population, if you take out slaves, it's about 4 to 1. Right? GNP, about a little over 10 times the GNP. Remember, the North is industrializing. The South, The planners want an aristocratic society like sort of 14th century France. They can't have serfs, so they have slaves, right? That's what they want. And the cost of that is your GNP isn't all that. The industrial establishments about 5 times in the north. And importantly, the north gets most of the arsenals. There's Harper's Ferry right out the river on the border between, and you know, when Lee goes to Antietam, he sends Stonewall Jackson down to Harper's Ferry, steal everything, you know, all the sabers, all the serfs, all the saddles, because the South needs those supplies. Now, the South does develop a defense industry. There's a guy named Goethals who does a remarkable job, but they start out at a disadvantage, and I'm not sure, you know, the Spencer, the Sharps, all those breech-loading rifles, that's all from Connecticut. That's where the gun industry was in this country back in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. I don't know that, I mean, the South is getting rifled stuff from the British, but I'm not sure they ever had a breech loader. And since it takes special ammunition, you know, you kill a Union soldier, grab his breech loader. If you don't have his ammunition, it's useless to you. So this is just, the South is at a decided disadvantage. Its advantage is it doesn't have to do anything, right? Just sit there and look like an independent country. And if the North doesn't do anything, over time, maybe the British will recognize us, maybe the French will. 4 theaters. Can you see the brown here? That's mountains. I always joke that if you're from Colorado, that's just a little bumpy, you know. You know, well, Saturday morning we'll stand on McPherson's Ridge, and if you're from Colorado, this is just flat ground, you know. But if you're from Pennsylvania, well, you can see there's grazing fire down toward Willoughby Run. Yeah, but there just isn't anything like the Rockies South. So this is the Appalachians, and it effectively separates the two armies. So you have an Eastern theater. This is where Lee is. I'm not sure Lee ever leaves Virginia. Remember, when he gives up his commission, he says, I cannot take up arms against my fellow Virginians. He's very much a states' rights guy. So this is where Lee fights. It's where McClellan and Meade are all schooled. Very narrow theater, about 100 miles at its widest between the ocean and the mountains. Rivers all run east-west, so they're a pain in the neck to get across. There's the Western Theater, much more open, wider. Rivers tend to run a little bit north-south. Grant uses them to invade Mississippi and Alabama. Very innovative guy. So there's Eastern Theater, Western Theater. There's the ocean. Navy shuts that off. Here's Mobile, way up in here. And now you can see why it's so hard to take. And Wilmington is here. Besides those ports, they pretty much shut down cotton. That's where you get Red Butler. He's a gun runner, a cotton runner, fabulously rich at the end of the war. Basically buys the plantation. You know, the first popular war profiteer. And he's so good looking. And then the third theater is the Deep South. This blue line from Atlanta to Savannah is Sherman's march to the sea. This is sort of in the fall of '64. They've taken Tennessee. Sherman's in Chattanooga. Grant, who is now in charge of the Army, says, go down and take Atlanta. We know from the movie he burned it, or at least that's what the movie says. I don't know what he did to Atlanta, but they certainly weren't happy with him there. And then Grant, you know, who's still surrounding Lee up around Petersburg at the end of the Overland campaign, says, come on up here and give me a hand. And Sherman says, nah, I don't think I'll do that. I'm going to take, this is me speaking, I'm going to take the hard hand of war to these Southerners. You know, if you're down here, you might be hungry, but you haven't seen war, right? It's all up here. And so he burns his way down to Savannah. Ostensibly, he's chasing Joe Johnson, still alive and well, and actually a pretty good general. And then he chases him up here and corrals him up here, and Johnson surrenders maybe a couple of days after Appomattox. Okay, so that's the fourth theater. You know, just remember, how do you square your vision of the war with all the uncertainty? I don't think Lincoln wants to invade the South. I don't think he wants to burn his way through anywhere. But after Gettysburg, and remember Vicksburg, where is it? right here, falls the day after Pickett's charge. Right? So in July of 1863, you could be forgiven for thinking it's time for the South to give it up. You know, they've lost, they've been cut off from the western side of the Mississippi, and their last invasion has been a failure. Instead, you know, the next year Lee has another army. They're still fighting. And I think Lee just said, what the hell do I have to do to win this war? And this is the kind of strategic choice you have to make. Okay, I have my strategy. It's working, but it's not working well enough. And I think Lincoln said, okay, we're going to have to take off the gloves and really get nasty here. And Sherman is the embodiment of that. Forever hated in the South, obviously. I'm here for the South. You know, should have asked this at first. When I teach 501 and get to the Civil War, I always ask this because, you know, have you noticed Georgetown's pretty much a Yankee school, right? Yeah, you know that. But you know, if you were raised in the South, you were intimately familiar with at least the South's version of the Civil War, right? Usually students, we learned state history from first grade. We visited every battlefield within 100 miles of the school. My grandmother wouldn't let a Yankee on the property. I mean, this is today. In the North, now let me see, the Civil War. Is that after the Revolution or before? You know, and you know, I'm from Pittsburgh. I know nothing about the Civil War, right? I didn't. You know, the North just turns its back and walks away. We're now revisiting that history because the South, you know, has the lost cause myth, which a lot of people have problems with. So, a book like Cherno's biography, Grant, McPherson, you know, trying to correct the record. In the lost cause myth, Grant's an alcoholic, Sherman's a war criminal, Sheridan's a war criminal, Lee is a tyrant. Okay, there are different interpretations. Okay. But you know, you gotta, I mean, okay, a couple of technologies. Rifling is introduced in the 1850s. It's not the rifle, it's the ammunition, the invention of the brass cartridge case, which finally solved the problem of leakage out of the end of the breech of a breech-loading rifle. So going into the Civil War, the North has Spencers, it has Sharps, it has a bunch. In fact, when we get to Gettysburg, you'll go into the Visitor Center, which is really nice. It has one of the biggest bookstores you're going to see in any of these visitor centers. So carry some money, your credit card, get some books. You'll see several different kinds of breech loaders. The key to the breech loader is the ammunition. And if you don't have it, then you better find yourself a musket. The other solution to the rifling problem was the mini-ball. And the Army introduces the rifle musket. All that is a rifled musket where the mini ball is soft leaded, you drop it down the barrel, and then you pound on a little and it spreads out, fills the rifling grooves. Okay, so it takes a long time to load, but it's 300 yards accuracy, and it's soft lead. So it's like a dum-dum, which we would rule, the Red Cross would rule it illegal today. You know, I mean, this is why you have such horrific wounds and so much amputation in the Civil War. I mean, the thing hits you in the arm, shatters all the bones in your arm or whatever. Okay, so all of these rifling technologies increase the range and the accuracy. So, and we'll do this on Saturday morning. You're on McPherson's Ridge. Buford's guys have rifled carbines. Buford's the cavalry unit that first engages the South. They're firing slightly downhill, and they've got 300 yards, maybe even longer range. You know, imagine they had muskets, 25, 30, 40 yards. The South would get all the way up to, you know, almost shouting distance. And okay, the Union gets one shot, it's now going to take 30 seconds to reload, and the South charges. That's sort of the offensive-defensive balance in the Napoleonic era. Rifles shattered. And the Civil War is the first war where we see that. You see it in the Franco-Prussian, the Austro-Prussian wars after the Civil War. Okay, so the power of the defense, and Lee runs into this at Malvern Hill. Even while he's trouncing McClellan on the peninsula, he charges just like Pickett. He charges into the Union, and it's entrenched, and he takes an enormous amount of casualties. Don't move. Okay, there is a debate about how many rifles were. Oh, I have a great second you know, post hoc general, you know. I have great respect for generals who are dealing with uncertainty, don't worry. Nobody knows quite how many rifles there were. Welso, I don't know whether they still assign the reading on his reading. He says, look, there were rifles, but nobody knew how to aim. They all fired high, so they weren't relevant at Pickett's charge. I think that's wrong. I think what happened was, you know, if you were a good marksman, you got to lie down there at the stone wall and shoot, and then you'd hand the rifle back and somebody would give you another rifle. So you had some of the lesser shots reloading. And you're kind of a rapid fire machine there, right? So I think rifles made a serious difference. But there's, even to this day, I mean, Welso's book is 150 years, 2013. So he's still wondering about this issue. There's some rifled artillery. You'll see that, well, you won't see it. It's on the other side of the monument. We'll be up on Oak Hill. This is up there. It's a 3-inch kind of a British contraption, and Brett Butler brings 4 of them back after one of his trips. So the South have 2 of these at Gettysburg. The problem here is command and control. This thing will fire 12 kilometers, right? So who's going to call you on their cell phone and tell you, you missed, you know? I mean, you can't see anything, right? So these guys take part in Pickett's charge. They just don't know what they're shooting at. You know, it's not until Marconi that we can talk to one another, and it takes a while. You know, another good example of that is airplanes in World War I. You know, you're up there in 1914, August, September, and you can see the enemy laid out. Okay, how do I tell the commander on the ground? Well, I can write it on a message and drop a stone. I mean, I'm not joking. Pew, bonk, and you know, okay, they can read that. I can land. Finally, I mean, Marconi's actually invented the radio, but it's not on any of the airplanes. Finally, they go to Morse code. In one of the regions, you have a second guy in the cockpit. He's back there with a Morse code key strapped to his leg, and he's sending Morse down. But commanding, you know, this is where technology outran command and control. There are books, you know, the history of war in terms of command and control. We don't read them because they're boring, but it's incredibly important, right? Command and control. Okay. War to 1863. The North almost isolates the South. It almost closes down the coast. It almost closes down the Mississippi. If you look at a map, anybody been to Vicksburg? I have not, but it's weirdly low. I mean, the river goes like this, right? And it's up on a promontory. It's just very difficult to get at, right? Yeah, so the North doesn't until Grant comes along and finally, and he does a kind of a crossing and then comes around behind and lays siege from the rear. Very hard to get at. So they're almost shut down. Farragut takes New Orleans very early on. It's the only city of over 20,000 in the South. It's a very strange city. It still is. I mean, in the sense that, you know, it was French and Spanish and then American, and so its legal system is not like the rest of the United States, I'm told. I've never committed a crime there. I don't know the answer to that. But, it has a freed slave community. It has a mulatto community. They have their own newspapers, their own banks. All of that ends because of the Civil War. They were as oppressed as everybody else after it's over. But going into the war, it's a very different city. The Eastern Theater, the West is all right. I mean, Grant has finally risen to the top, and he's taken everything to Vicksburg. The Eastern Theater goes very poorly. That's Lee's first campaign, the Peninsula Campaign, 7 days. Antietam, Lee crosses the river out of Harper's Ferry, occupies Frederick for a week. Good time, parties every night. Now, this is a true story. Jeb Stuart, who's kind of a ladies' man, they hold a dance at the local women's college, whatever. And so he's there with his troops, and in the middle of it, you know, up comes a courier. We got a problem. The North is coming at it. He says, "Excuse me, ladies," and he rides off. He comes back later, all covered with it. It's all right now, you know. I mean, I think this is a true story. Occupies and then finally winds up fighting at Sharpsburg or Antietam, and you know, McClellan calls that a huge victory. It's a tie and a very bloody one, mostly because of the stupid way. Well, McClellan didn't manage the battle. You know, Lee is up on his horse, going back and forth, moving brigades, moving battalions. McClellan's back at the Pry House. It's a mile away. He can't even see Burnside's bridge. It's the Rohrbach Bridge back then, until Burnside loses so many men, they name it after it. And he never commits his cavalry. He never commits a whole corps. I mean, okay, and then Lee escapes 2 days later. Right, because if you look at the map, you're right up against the Potomac, so he's across the Potomac the next day. The one thing that Antietam allows Lee to do is publish the first version of the Emancipation Proclamation. He starts working on this the previous spring, and he tells his cabinet, it's time, you know, that we made slavery the issue. It's been the issue, it's time we publish that. And they read it, and they're impressed, but they say, you know, boss, you can't do this right now because you're losing, and it just looks like a desperate act. Wait till you've got something to brag about. Antietam is enough of a victory to brag about. Lee puts it out the very next week after. Now, the legislation, the Emancipation Proclamation, then is January, that January, about 2 months later. What this does is tell the world this is really about slavery. And Britain outlawed slavery. Palmerston, it's not clear to me whether Palmerston, the Prime Minister, really wanted to be involved in this war or not, but at that point it allows him to just tell the textile manufacturers who are lobbying for the British to come in on the war, it's immoral, you know, can't back slave states. So in a way, even though it's not a victory, it is a turning point in the war, because to me, at that point, the Europeans aren't coming in on this. South had been hoping for that. It's not going to happen. Military situation, I don't need to go into too much of this. In the Eastern Theater, Hooker is in charge in April. Fighting Joe Hooker. Actually, that's not his name. It's Joe Hooker. The newspaper headline was supposed to have a comma. Fighting Joe Hooker invades the South, right? They lose the comma, so it becomes Fighting Joe Hooker. And, I kid you not, and Lee would just fighting Joe Hooker, or he'd call him Mr. F.J. Hooker. I mean, Lee had no respect for these guys at all. Hooker, with a larger force, charges down toward Frederick and Chancellorsville. Lee has the smaller force. He splits it, and he decisively defeats Hooker. And a lot of that is Stonewall Jackson, who does a kind of an end run around and comes up on the Union flank and just collapses their front. The downside of that is that night he's wounded by one of his troops, right? He's out checking his pickets. And he's shot in the arm. He dies a week or two later of an infection, maybe pneumonia, which is the way a lot of things happen there. I mean, it's not just the bullet, it's the infection. Nobody discovered germs until about 1870 or 80. Anybody use Listerine? John Lister, British surgeon, who I think he's a British surgeon, conceives of the fact that there were germs. In the Civil War, they don't know what they're doing, so they're just washing wounds with some sponge that's lying around. They have no idea that they're spreading infection. Just makes you want to cringe. Okay, so when Lee goes in to talk to Davis about strategy in May, he could not be more famous. And his army just, when they get to Gettysburg, they just think, we're gonna win this one, right? We are unstoppable. So he has a lot of leverage in that strategy session. This is where Jim Raybon will start talking on the bus going up on Saturday morning. Hooker is still the commanding general. He sort of notices that Lee is on the move toward the end of May, early June of '63. One reason is an entrepreneur sold to the North 4 lighter than air balloons, and they have a couple of those up, and they can see things moving. Hooker's plan, and it might have worked, is to cross over the mountains and take Lee from the rear. To do that, he needs the forces that the Union keeps at Harper's Ferry, and Lincoln and Halleck don't trust him enough, and so he resigns. And that's how Meade, Lee is wandering through your territory, and you don't have a general, so he orders Meade. And that's why Meade is in charge. And Meade does a good job at Gettysburg. Not the most likable guy in the world, but a good job. Okay, this is Gettysburg. This is a map. Lee had his staff engineer draw for him in February of '63. You know, now this doesn't mean he knows there's going to be a battle at Gettysburg. He does notice all of these, just like a spider web, right? Gettysburg, Raybon says it's where you go to die in Pennsylvania. I mean, it's just everything goes through here. Yeah, Jim's a little more morose than I am. But it's his boots and saddles. He's a CAPP guy. You just have to get used to it. So this is a strategic point. You can control this. You control a lot of southwestern Pennsylvania, right? So Lee doesn't necessarily think that's where we're going to have a battle. In fact, he's just looking for a meeting. You know, he wants to meet in the open. This is where it happens, and he's aware of Gettysburg. So it's on his radar screen, as we say today. Okay. By the way, notice that I count Gettysburg as a 2-week battle. It's 3 days, 1, 2, 3 of July. It takes Lee 11 days to get across the Potomac. I mean, Meade has any number of opportunities to surround this guy and collapse him or whatever. Fails miserably. So I think it's a 2-week battle. The crux of it is obviously Pickett's charge on day 3. But anybody read, do you still read Supreme Command, Elliott Cohen's book? You know, the very first chapter is on Lincoln, and it starts, if I remember correctly, with that letter he writes to Meade, where it starts like, I don't think you realize how badly you failed me. He never sends that letter, right? That's Elliott's making a point there, you know, but he writes it because to him, Gettysburg could have been worse, but we had a chance to end it. Anyway. Okay, this is Gettysburg. Now, this is the town. You can see, you know, sort of all these things coming in. We'll come in, the visitor center's here. This is Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. The Union general that is leading the left flank of the Union as it goes north is John Reynolds. Anybody read Killer Angels? You got it. There's no, actually there is a movie on this. It's the basis for the movie Gettysburg by Michael Sheriff, and it's so beautifully written. And you know, Reynolds is a Pennsylvanian. He was commander of the militia in Pennsylvania before the Civil War. He knows the terrain here, right? He's talking to the commander of 11th Corps, Oliver Otis Howard, gave you Howard University, big name. 11th Corps commander, and he says, look, if we get to Gettysburg, you get on that hill and protect it. And Howard does. That's about all he protects because he sends his corps north and it just gets bashed by Lee the first day. The war actually starts, the battle starts here. This is McPherson's Ridge. And it starts because the day before, you know, Lee's army is sort of, some of Buell's cavalry is over at Harrisburg. And they're even talking, why don't we just take Harrisburg and make Lee governor of Pennsylvania? They want to embarrass Lincoln. You know? They don't do that. But the South is spread out behind the mountains mostly, all the way over to Harrisburg. A.P. Hill, one of the Corps commanders, sends a unit into Gettysburg to ferret out. He says later it's about shoes. Yeah, they're just looking for food. I mean, the South is hungry, right? Anything you got, we're going to take. And we'll pay you for it with Confederate currency, which is worth exactly that much, right? So they're on their way out. And in comes John Buford, a really professional cavalry commander. He's the best the Union has. And he is so worn out, by the way, he dies by the end of the year of just typhus or something. He's just been in the saddle for a long, long time. So Buford's coming into town while these foraging party is pulling out. This is the night of the 30th of June. And the foraging party goes back to A.P. Hill and says, boss, we saw Union regulars in there, and nobody believes it. Remember, Jeb Stuart is off running circles around the Yankees, right? He's nowhere to be found. Lincoln, the only reason Lee knows that the Union is this far north is the spy. And if you had read Killer Angels, you'd know that Henry, and I've forgotten his last name, Hamilton maybe, is a Southern failed actor who is a spy for Longstreet. The spy is riding through this country looking for his wife who ran off. And he doesn't want, it's the best acting job he ever does. But he does sort of down in here cross what looks to be an awfully deeply worn track of a big army. And so he goes to Longstreet, who's somewhere over here. This is maybe the 28th. And he says, I think you've got the Union Army right across from you. And nobody thinks that the Union Army got off that fast. They think they're still down in Frederick, Maryland. So Lee knows, or at least he thinks he knows, the Union may be further north. But anyway, they are. They're in Gettysburg. And so the next morning, then, A.P. Hill sends an entire, well, 2 brigades of a division down this Chambersburg pike, also was sometimes called the Cashtown pike. Leads back at Cashtown, it's back over here. And they go in the morning. Buford sees the whole battle the night before and sets himself up. We'll talk about this on Saturday, and that's where the battle starts. Okay, so, and then Howard comes up. Well, Reynolds comes in with his first corps and fights this battle. Howard comes up, he puts a division on the hill, and then sends 2 other divisions north as Ewell's corps comes back down from Harrisburg. And the first days, Lee doesn't want a big battle, but he can see, hey, I can win this one today. And so by the end of the day, they have a coordinated assault on the Union here, and the Union collapses and runs back through town. In fact, one of the division commanders, I think it's Schimmelpfennig. There's a lot of German immigrants and a lot of Irish immigrants in this army. Schimmelpfennig winds up in a kind of a chicken coop or a pigsty in somebody's backyard. He's running through town, he's cornered, and he hides there for 3 days. And they feed him, but, so it's just a complete rout. But Howard has taken this hill and has started to defend it with artillery, started to dig in. And so this whole business north of town, that's the first day, and we'll start here, and then we'll go up to Oak Hill here, and then we'll come down here, because after the first day, this battle is from here south. You've got Cemetery Ridge going down to Little Round Top, and you've got Seminary Ridge kind of going down into nowhere. So Pickett's charge is here. Okay, so the first time I went up there, I didn't realize we were kind of circling the town. We start northwest, we go north, and the whole battle shifts south. Day 2 and 3 are all across these ridges. Okay? Questions on that? Yeah?
So I was going to ask, so Howard has like 3 divisions that he uses the first 2 on the
He puts, I forget the name of it's another, Steinwehr. And by the way, this I think becomes Steinwehr Road. But he puts Steinwehr in his division here. He's then got Barlow and Schimmelpfennig, and they go north. And my sense is that he doesn't really manage the deployment. And they go out in different directions. Barlow winds up, sort of halfway to Harrisburg, and so they're taken apart piecemeal. And they both, and Barlow himself is wounded, and everybody thinks he's dead. He comes out of it. It's funny. I mean, you get hit in the arm and die of infection or pneumonia. He was hit right here. I mean, the bullet passes 2 inches from his spine, and he's fine 20 years later. I don't get it. It's funny because there's a brigade commander named John Gordon in Ewell's corps. There's got to be 5 John Gordons, including the one who will be one of your guides on. They're not related, or maybe they are. But Gordon sees that Barlow's on the ground bleeding, and he's a commander. Gets off his horse, gives him some water, and he says to his troops, "Look, this guy's going to die, but get him in the shade." So they get him in the shade. Now, in Gordon's memoirs, which may be partly fictionalized, he says they're at something up in New York City, and Barlow comes over and says, "Are you the John Gordon who was at Gettysburg?" And they become friends 20 years later. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but he does live. He does live. There's crazy stories like that all over. Okay. Lee, after Gettysburg, he does retreat back across the Potomac, seriously bloodied. Bigley says, you know, the American Way of War. I don't know whether you still read those chapters or not. He's never going to invade the North again. His army is too damaged. And in fact, Guelso's book on Gettysburg is Gettysburg: The Last Invasion. He just doesn't have the ability to do it again. Vicksburg falls the next day. Meade doesn't pursue. He does pursue. It takes him about 3 days to get going. They never get close. And Lincoln is left with the search for another general. This is the Wilderness Campaign in '64. Grant's in charge. It starts up north of the Rappahannock. It goes down to the Wilderness, which is a terrible, terrible battle. Then it goes to Spotsylvania. Then it goes to North Anna River. I'm sorry we don't make you read that 300-page book anymore. Grimsley is the guy's name. One of the really good Civil War historians.
We read about 110 pages.
You do?
Yeah, 100.
Oh, I thought the minute I retired, Grimsley was gone. So actually, Grant finally surrounds Lee at Petersburg. I think, Lee hasn't met Grant and Grant hasn't met Lee. They are different generals, but they're both really good. And so this, if you want to call Grant a butcher, this is a bloody campaign. Grant doesn't want it to be that way. In fact, out west, he's a master of maneuver. He just can't get by Lee. Lee is too quick, right? On the other hand, Lee can't beat Grant either. And when they get down here, Grant actually crosses the James River in record speed. Lee just doesn't even understand how it's an engineering feat that's in the textbooks. But they surround Lee, and Lee sees it coming. He says, "Look, if we don't defeat Grant somewhere, it's going to become a siege, and we're going to lose." And that's what happens. But it takes, Petersburg is in June of '64. Appomattox is April of '65. They're all penned up in here. There's one railroad coming in, and Lee makes use of that. In the end, the Union starts to close off that railroad. Lee's experiencing a huge desertion problem at this point. Nobody wants to be in this war anymore, So he makes a break for it, and Appomattox, I can't remember, is out here somewhere. Over the course of a couple of weeks, Grant chases them and defeats them and gets them to surrender. Okay? That's Sherman's March to the Sea. The war ends. Appomattox is April 9th. The three other Confederate armies surrender very soon thereafter. Less than a week later, Lincoln dies. Whatever vision he had dies with him. And frankly, it's not clear he would have done any better with Reconstruction. It's not. There's no evidence that he had not only a vision, but a sense of how you're going to implement this. But I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. He certainly would have been better than Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson, Johnson. This is like Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. This weird language guy from Boston with that weird accent. We'll give him a Texas politician, right? Well. Lincoln is from Illinois. Johnson's from Tennessee. He is a slave owner. But when the South secedes, he stays in the Senate. So they're looking to balance the ticket in 1863 and 4, and they pick Andrew Johnson, and that would have been fine if Lincoln had lived. Instead, he doesn't share. In fact, I think I have it on the next. He basically, in the year after the Civil War, turns his back, lets the planters reestablish their power. By the end of the year, black codes are appearing in the legal structures of these states. That it's sort of separate but equal. They're not slaves, but we will make sure they aren't free either. Okay, the Congress notices that. They start to pass amendments. 14th and 15th are the Reconstruction amendments. They also try to impeach Johnson. Johnson wants to fire Seward, who is a real abolitionist cabinet member, and the Congress won't let it happen. And it's a kind of a technical legal battle. They fail. And what emerges in the South is an insurgency, in my view. Not just the Ku Klux Klan, although every state has a militia, a white militia, right? There's a Texas, maybe I have it in, no, I don't think I do. There's a Texas legislator who in 1866 says, in Texas, murder is a state's right. Because we're not going to prosecute anybody who lynches a freed slave. And they didn't for about 130 years. We're still dealing with some of those things now. The last lynchings were like 50 something, right? 53. It curls your hair. Okay, this is a former North Carolina governor speaking after the war ends with reference not to the war, but to emancipation. We're just at the beginning. Boy, if that, looking back, hire this guy, he sees it. Nobody's listening. At least I'd love to maybe get a biography of him and see what happens to him. But this, to me, the war's not over when you defeat the other side. The war's over when you have a political settlement that satisfies you. And that's a long way off. Grant actually, and I think Chernow works hard to be very objective about Grant. He's a two-term president. Believe it or not, he's the most popular American at the time, and there's talk in the Republican Party of a third term, which Grant wants nothing to do with. His wife kind of likes living in the White House, I like it. Okay. In his first term, he conceived that the South has begun to undo what he thought he won at Appomattox. And he mobilizes the military in the South. It's a small occupation force. To both suppress the Klan, and the word is the South Carolina Klan was routed by Union forces, and also to protect the polls during voting. So for 4 years, he goes over to the Hill in '71 with what he calls his most important piece of legislation, which is the anti-Klan bill. Takes his entire cabinet with him. He sits down with the key legislators and he says, if you pass nothing else this year, pass this, and they do. The second term is sort of a very quick downhill. I don't know whether it's widely known. The country had the biggest recession in its history until 1932. The railroads are vastly overinvested, and that whole banking edifice collapses. So in the North, they're already starting to tire of the Southern problem. Could we just get back to work? They also worry that, all these freed slaves are going to come north and take our jobs, right? And jobs are scarce at this time. And Grant, frankly, is an odd guy. He's naive in trusting people, and he picks people that swindle him. So he's losing political power. He'd love to pass another Klan bill. Can't do it. So, and then Ruther, yeah.
Sorry, what did the Klan bill do?
Declared them illegal, and I think mobilized the military and allowed the military to interfere in the Klan's activities. That's a good question, though. I would maybe by Saturday I'll have an answer for that. Are you going up?
No.
Okay. Oh. The Hayes election of 1876 is extremely complicated, and I'm not going to recount it for you because I don't remember a lot of it. It's a tied election, sort of. Hayes needs electoral college votes, so he goes to all the states in the South and he says, give me your electoral college votes and I'll get the Union forces out of the South. And they do. And he takes office in 1877 and bing, the Union is out of the South. So you can really date the end of Reconstruction right there in 1877. And I think if you're a free slave in 1880, you're not free. You've been re-enslaved, right? You're not. In fact, there's a planner who says at some point in the next 50 years, because it doesn't change much. When they were slaves, we had to take care of them. Now we just rent them. We don't care what. We don't take care of them. It's even worse. And you keep them down with a set of banking arrangements that they can never get out of debt, of sharecropping. They can never grow enough crops. And then when they get out of line, you lynch one or two, and that, you terrorize. In fact, I know you don't read the Post. But if you look at this morning's Post, I mean, hold it in your hands. This isn't a computer screen. And look at the op-ed page. Charles Lane he has just written a book on this. He has an op-ed on America's first anti-terrorism campaign, which is that. So this stuff is very much current. Okay, the North just gives up. And I think it goes back, I think that goes back to racism in the North. There's just no constituency in the North for taking a freed slave and making him a citizen with all the rights of everybody else. Okay. And this is a very cynical statement. The North, if you're a citizen in the North, maybe the Civil War gave you exactly the political solution you wanted. You freed the slaves, but they stay in the South. So they don't come up here and compete for my job, live down the street. They don't come up until the Great Migration of the 20s and 30s, right? And now the North has a problem, and you can see how wonderfully we handled that, right? I mean, the racism is still very much there. Okay, there is, though, in the years after the Civil War, you see it in today's Republicans, work requirements for Medicare. There's this deep suspicion that if we help this group of people, they'll become dependent on it and then they'll take advantage of it, right? The welfare queen argument of the Reagan. And so, hey, we freed the blacks. It's up to them. They can do what we did. They can become citizens, right? I mean, there are such things as structural causes of poverty and oppression. and I think that's still an issue of debate between Democrats and Republicans. Desire to get back to exporting cotton. It takes, the British and the French go to Egypt and India, and by the end of the Civil War, the South has real competition. They do finally get back up to their pre-war export levels about 1880. And here's the last reason. Before 1860, you could live your life and never deal with the federal government, right? You deal with state, local officials. I mean, the Founding Fathers really didn't see a big federal government. Suddenly, Lincoln is spending billions of dollars to fight a war. And these guys are drafting you or they're in your face. That scares everybody. The notion that you would maintain that level of federal government intrusion is abhorrent. And so the wind goes out of the sails because of that, too. Okay. A point that we make repeatedly in 501 is and if it weren't for my experience in Desert Storm, where we really hadn't thought through the end before we got into the beginning, you don't get a better peace just by winning. In fact, the North Vietnamese sort of got a better peace by just losing and waiting us out, right? Winning helps, but you don't. Okay. And once started, you lose control of this. And I think Lincoln. Well, nobody knew how this war was going to go. They go out to the first Battle of Bull Run thinking, we'll bloody the South and everything will end, right? 4 years later, Grant is smashing his way down to the South, lots of love on the ground. All of the things Clausewitz talks about, fog, friction, are there. So, my take on this is you don't get into one of these. Well, Iraq, a war of choice. We get into it, mispredicting. And not everybody mispredicted. Unfortunately, Rumsfeld, Cheney, the leadership of the country mispredicted, and we're there for 15 years, right? So you don't start one of these things unless you have to, because once you're in it, you don't control it, and you don't get out of it until the other side, Holler's uncle, okay? And this is one of my this is even better than Clausewitz. Faulkner, who's from what, Mississippi, Alabama? I think he's Alabama. Mississippi? Okay. The past is never dead. It's not even the past. Just, if you're, that'll keep you up at nights if you start to think about it, right? He's from the South, where the past really is alive. But, okay, so we're from the North, but we're still living with that past, right? It's not dead. It's not the past. So, but it is appropriate that someone from the Deep South would have that. I think probably an Irish man. The Irish remember their history very, with the British. It's a memorable history. Again, there's these populations that really remember their history. Okay, I've talked my usual hour, I suspect even longer. Sorry, but questions? Yeah.
So, when Grant becomes president, how effective was like the Union Army with the occupation of the South? Now, like Freedom's Bureau and everything, but as far as like what?
The Union Army goes from 1 million people to 50,000 by 1870. Most of them, now the South calls this massive occupation, right? Most of this army is out in the West killing Native Americans. Really, and you want racism, go out there, right? I mean, we regard Native Americans with the same disdain that we regard Africans. There's a book called 1877, the year after Reconstruction ends, which just goes through violence. There's labor, there's railroad strikes. How do we put that down? We call in the feds, right? It can be pretty depressing. I read it a kind of a chapter every month. So the Union Army, the biggest Union contingent occupying a Confederate state is in Texas, and mostly it's cooperating with the Texas militia in fighting Native Americans. So there's not a huge occupation. And once Grant loses the power to move the Union Army, and when he gets, in 1868, Sherman's in Washington, the commander. Sheridan is down in New Orleans, and he just says, okay, Sheridan, go, mobilize your military and go after the Klan, protect the polls. There's enough of a force to do that. I'd like to see that campaign plan, because I don't know what the numbers are, and I don't know how many polling places. It's a good question. Yeah. Did what?
What role did guerrilla warfare serve?
Well, I don't know that you call it, you had the Mosbys, right? In fact, if you take Route 50 west, it becomes the General John J. Mosby Highway. My kid was married there last fall, at one of these venues out there, and what? The Mosby, wait a minute. We're working on Davis Highway here, but, it turns out that when Grant was president, Mosby was actually helpful to him. But in the war, he was a guerrilla, I guess, a cavalry, kind of a cavalry commander. In some ways, the Klan is a guerrilla force, right? It's an insurgency. That's after the war. But still, it's a challenge to the Union that they just don't meet after about 1870. Yeah.
Wasn't that kind of how Lincoln kind of pushed the terms of surrender to be more lenient because they feared guerrilla? Lincoln thought if they were too harsh in terms of surrender that they would have a guerrilla war.
I'm not aware of that logic, although I don't know. Grant and Lincoln meet just before Appomattox, right? You saw the movie. They're sitting there on the porch. But they do talk, and that might have been...
Sherman's memoir, he talks about.
Oh, does he? Well, you're ahead of me. I've never read...
It's the only book I read that you didn't today.
Pardon me?
It's the only book I read today.
Well, good for you. Jim Raybon, who is the only person in the three of us who doesn't have a PhD, he's reading Henry Hunt's memoirs. Henry Hunt's the Union artillery commander. That's years away from me. I'm still sort of reading basic books. So there's a lot out there to read. And if Sherman says it, actually Sherman's not there. I'm not sure how he knows that, but I could imagine that being part of the conversation. In the end, the conventional armies surrender, right, all four of them. And then there is a guerrilla warfare afterwards. The Klan, the violence starts right away. What Lincoln would have done had he been alive and seen that is a good question. Andrew Johnson just turns his back on it. It's funny because Andrew Johnson wants to try the generals and hang them for treason. But the planners are fine, And one of the reasons Jubal Early, who is one of the inventors of the Lost Cause story, Early leaves the country right after the Civil War is over. One, he doesn't want to live in a country that doesn't have slaves. He's a dyed-in-the-wool slave guy. He really wants to take the South back to 1800. Two, he doesn't want to get hanged. So he doesn't come back, you know, Grant has to come to Andrew Johnson and say, that's not the terms of our settlement, knock it off. And Johnson does. Okay, but until then, Johnson actually wants to go after and prosecute the generals. So there's a guerrilla war afterwards. And we handle that about as well as we handle Vietnam. You know, we're just not, but this is on our own turf. Okay, okay. Well, I'll see some of you on Saturday. And if this gets you interested, it's a fascinating thing to, and you will invariably start, you know, you start with Gettysburg and then you just go out. You go back and look at the politics of 1815. You go forward and you look at the evolution of attitudes in the South and the North. It slowly opens up American history, and it's not a pretty picture, but I do think most of us, at least when I was in high school, before your parents were even born, you know, you learned history as a series of very satisfying myths, right? Well, myth is the right word. I mean, American history is not all that pretty. There's a lot of violence in it, a lot of racism. And it's taken me, you know, a long life to kind of unpack that. I hope they teach it better now than they did when I was young. Okay, see ya.